The problem we've had today in academia is that we equate myth and mythology with falsehood. And why is this? Because we say it doesn't have facts. This didn't actually happen. The Good Samaritan wasn't a real person in history. Therefore, it's a lie. Jesus told us all a lie. Good Samaritan never existed. Therefore, it's a myth and it's all a big lie. That's literally how we look at myth today. All of Jesus's parables mean nothing. They're useless because they don't have facts in them. How are we going to then take the Bible that seriously if we're throwing out these kinds of stories that didn't factually occur? So myths are stories that didn't factually occur, but they contain truth in them, true values. And sometimes you're not going to get those values otherwise. Hey everybody, this is Jon Croft with Culture Warfare with Jon Croft, and I'm Jon Croft. How's everybody doing tonight? Rebecca Croft's here tonight. How you doing, Rebecca?
I'm doing great. Good to see you. How are you doing?
Doing good. Yeah, so who knows? This might be our last podcast at our location where we're at now in Florida. We may be moving to another state coming up soon. We'll see. We're getting everything set up to move. Should be lots of stressful fun during the holidays, moving during the holidays. I never thought we'd be doing this, but here we are. What do you think, Rebecca? Stressed out yet?
Just trusting in the Lord.
Amen. Yeah, that's what we have to do sometimes. Sometimes we want to, sometimes we don't want to, sometimes we have to. Right?
Oh, yeah.
And we have to because we want to. So.
And it turns out he is trustworthy.
Turns out.
Yeah.
Turns out our God is a certain kind of God, not just any kind of God. Turns out he's worth actually obeying and following because he's a loving God. So
he is.
And he teaches us what love even is. So many people don't even know what it is. They think it's some kind of like nice affection. No, it's like dying for somebody. So Christ taught us what true love is. So, yeah, it's pretty great. We are in the midst, and we wanted to talk about one of our classic subjects, except add a little extra stuff on it, which is to basically talk about Western civilizational works and to compare that with what our current culture is producing. And so it's like, why we can't have nice things? Why can we not have nice things? Because obviously there's some kind of issue in the community in which people don't get it. They don't understand that if they just did a certain thing, they could have the things that they needed and want, but they just refuse to do the certain thing. Sometimes it's very simple. Sometimes it's a little more complicated. I'll let you be the judge on if this is a simple matter, but I would just say this, starting out as an introduction. How are we going to know the kinds of better entertainment we can have if we don't know the kind of entertainment we have had in the past and compare that to the kind of entertainment we have now? And then kind of weigh it out. This is kind of what history does, right? It allows us to compare ourselves to the times in the past, the various times in the past. It could just be as far back as the ancient times of the 80s or the 70s. Oh, it's so ancient. Which is when I was a kid, by the way. Or it could be something maybe 100 years ago or 200 years ago, which when you think about it in the courses of time is not that long ago, considering history, right? So, and are we supposed to learn some history when we go to school? So this kind of gives you a clue right off the bat, starting out why we can't have nice things. In a way, it's just as simple as that, right? Because we don't study history. Let's talk about where we're at right now in our culture. Obviously, you have Western society, you have what's called modernism. Modernism occurred in about the late 1700s. Really, the 1800s is when it really picked up steam, so to speak. And then in the early 1900s, it really became a massive force by the 1900s. But obviously, the Industrial Revolution kind of kicked off modernism. It's kind of the philosophy that came alongside the Industrial Revolution. And after the after the Reformation and the Renaissance, right? And so the Reformation and the Renaissance says there's more to life than what Christendom has been, right? There's more to life than what Europe has been or has become. And so this wasn't necessarily a bad thing, right? At first, it was the idea of the divine leading us to better places. Um, I'm a Reformed Protestant Christian, so I obviously I still believe that the Reformation was a good thing because it was about something better. It's about something more divine, and but we also see value then. The idea of the Reformation was really not to discard the Catholic Church. And a lot of Catholics, I think, get this wrong. They think that we wanted to discard the Catholic Church. We wanted to reform it. We wanted to make it better. And that means take all the good things that came before the Roman Catholic Church and include all of those things. Include all the good things from Christ's day, from before Christ's day, from the first century church, from Constantine's time. What about the Nicene Creed? That's a good thing. Every Protestant I know believes in the Nicene Creed. I don't know any of them that don't. So to say that we're discarding the Roman Church is kind of silly idea. So there's this binary thinking that we get. Well, if you're not in favor of me, then you're not in favor of all these other things. We throw away the baby with the bathwater. No. In fact, the whole idea of conservatism is functionally that very thought. It's to take all the good things in history that worked and hold on to those things. And then we discard all the things that didn't work. The Catholic Church calls that tradition. And there's nothing wrong with that concept if tradition is actually a working tradition, if it actually functions and works the way it's meant to work, if it actually benefits mankind. And so if you think about that in terms of culture, you can look at the stories throughout culture and find the ones that work, the ones that make sense, the myths that contain truth, right? There are myths and stories that don't seem to contain as much truth and ones that do contain a ton of truth. In fact, didn't we talk about how Tolkien said some truths can only be conveyed to us through myths? And if we don't get those truths from those myths, we're just not going to get them. So the myth is like a little bundle of peanut butter for your dog to take his medicine, right? It's something for him to get that medicine. Otherwise he's not going to get that pill. So you want to get that medicine, and in order to get that, you're going to have to understand that myth is valuable and powerful and meaningful. So the truths come through myth. The problem we've had today in academia is that we equate myth and mythology with falsehood. And why is this? Because we say it doesn't have facts. There's no facts in here. This didn't actually happen. The Good Samaritan wasn't a real person in history. Therefore, it's a lie. Jesus told us all a lie because he told us the story of the Good Samaritan, and the Good Samaritan never existed. Therefore, it's a myth and it's all a big lie. That's literally how we look at myth today. All of Jesus's parables mean nothing. They're useless because they don't have facts in them. And so this is a real problem. How are we going to then take the Bible that seriously if we're throwing out these kinds of stories that didn't factually occur? So myths are stories that didn't factually occur, but they contain truth in them, true values. And sometimes you're not going to get those values otherwise. So number one, we can then keep in mind that these stories, these myths that contain truth, are really necessary to Western civilization, not only including the Bible, but including stories like Beowulf, including stories like the stories of the saints, which are often embellished, making them mythical, right, or legendary, as opposed to factual. Other examples of stories like this are things like King Arthur, right? King Arthur is obviously a mythical story in the sense that it's not even necessarily meant to be factual. The way they're written are more about symbols. They're more about an understanding of where power comes from and where nation comes from. And they're more about a period of time in in England's history in which they had to unite against Viking hordes and things like that. And all these little generals and tribesmen and warlords had to get together and band together and form their national identity together, and that takes time. And so Arthur's just a representation of that period, but not just, right? So these myths are that extra little bit that's like not just these facts, right? It's about the soul of the thing. And so many stories have tried to capture the heart of King Arthur, and yet so many of them fail. And that's because they also don't understand the heart and soul of England. And the England not of today, but the England of that time period. That's what the story is trying to convey, the England of that time period. And so if you want to falsify the past, you're obviously going to get the story of King Arthur wrong. If you don't want to accept the past for what it is and accept England for what it was at the time, you're obviously not going to demonstrate that the meaning behind King Arthur is what it is. You're going to try to cover that up or change it or propagandize it or make it what you want it to be, but it's not something that it is and that it was. And so, in my view, the only kind of person who can tell the story of King Arthur is someone like a historian who's also an artist, right? And who understands mythological epic poetry, things like this. So that's why people today can't do it. They just can't tell the story of King Arthur. We'll talk about that more at the end, though, because there might be an exception. But one of the things I wanted to really get into is the fact that our current state of the arts in conservatism and in Christianity is very uneducated, and tragically so. Our current arts in Hollywood is often uneducated, not across the board, because the world's best artists, especially filmmakers, will tend to go to Hollywood. And so they, of course, are going to respect a lot of the arts. Many of these people are really great artists. They're well read. They know what they're talking about. But the problem with Hollywood is that their politics is tone deaf and very 100 years ago, which is progressive, right? So progressivism is like a movement from 100 years ago. It's not really as relevant today. And so it's really showing in the public, right? With the receipts that they get in theaters. They're not really making the money that they used to make, and that's because they're very into their agenda, right? Which is propagandistic, very much in the vein of faith-based film. So faith-based film has been propagandistic for 20 years. Hollywood, probably more like 10 years. And so they must have learned something from their faith-based friends, and it's in the water. And so they looked at faith-based film and they said, that's what we want to do. We want to do more of that because that's the best stuff around is faith-based film. We're going to make our Hollywood films like that. We're just going to make it a little more attractive and artistic. But the message is the same kind of thing, right? So it's our way or the highway. It's what we believe in. And if you're not part of that, then you're weird and crazy and you're terrible and evil. And so it's full of a lot of this kind of ideology, sometimes visceral hatred. But what art really does well is tell the story of people in an empathetic way, real human people. And even the people who are in myths are based in real people. So they're still empathetic and real. If you read the Bible, you're going to get real people. You're going to get people like Moses who are imperfect. You're going to get people like Abraham who is imperfect. We were just talking about how I think it was, I don't remember which part in the New Testament. Do you remember
Yeah, I think it's in Peter, where he mentions like the
Peter?
women of old made themselves beautiful with good works. Is that what you're thinking
Yes.
of? Yeah.
Yes, we were just talking about Peter, I believe, how he was discussing the women of old, which is in the time of Abraham, and how they adorned themselves with lovely behavior as opposed to lovely jewelry.
Mm-hmm.
And if you know anything about Abraham, he was not always great to his wife, Sarai, and yet she was always gracious to him, calling him Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the example that Peter was using for a great woman. And so these are almost like mythical characters, but they're not. They're real people, right? So again, myth does not mean it's not real and not true. Myth means there's something more to it than just facts. There's real truth there. So let's just look at some examples of what's going wrong with our media now. Before I get all negative and just say all the negative things, there are a few positive things. I think you mentioned earlier today The Hiding Place, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is a story about World War II. And so there are biographical and autobiographical stories of great Christians who have done great things, right? Tip of the Spear. Is it the end of the spear, actually? Missionaries who got killed in South America. There's Corrie ten Boom, Hiding Place. Many other stories like this of Christians in the midst of trial and tribulation and them coming through on the other side, just like great people. Another one is, I think I have this book here. In God's Underground, Richard Wurmbrand.
Mm-hmm.
This was a story I remember about hearing about in the 80s about a Christian who was put in prison in the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe. So he was sharing Bibles in Eastern Europe,
Yeah.
got thrown in prison. And this was one of the things in the 80s that Christian patriots, Christian conservatives were all over and saying, this is the kind of thing we need to do in communist Russia or in behind the Iron Curtain is to give of our life for the sake of that a few people might find Christ. These are the kinds of things I think that broke communism apart. And this is a lot of the reason that people in Eastern Europe know God today. People like this. So those are important stories to tell. It's true. And then you have the stories of like a football team makes it to the championships. Oh my goodness, how do they do it except through the blood of Christ?
Mm-hmm.
That's just, wow. The tragedy there. I'm surprised they survived that bloodbath. I hear it's fought on a big field, about a football field size, just people falling dead. I mean, well, they're not dead, but okay. I'm being facetious here. I don't understand why Christians think this is heroic. I do think it's great when the great athletes do great things and they thank God for it, right? But the truth is, this kind of stuff is true athletic precision. This stuff is the kind of self-control that we need more of. And look, he's even praying on his knees right there. He's got some tough knees, let me tell you. So, and some tough resolve to suffer for Christ. Not just to win championships at a football stadium. So I think that we can do better in our entertainment. Like, Christ says, count the cost when you enter into his kingdom and you enjoy him. It's not just about the benefits. It's about the sacrifices you make. So, he's asking you to say, are you willing to give your life for this? And if our answer is like, well, if as long as I win the championship, then that's a problem, right? That's not real sacrifice. So you might work out a lot, but atheists do that and tremble. So there's better stuff we can do than what faith-based producers are producing. It should not all be feel-good stuff. If it was feel-good stuff, Christ would come off of that cross and be like, yeah, like Rocky. That's what we'd see, right? We'd see a Rocky Christ. Yeah, prosperity gospels. Yeah. Because I'm not supposed to be sicking up here on the cross, right? So, goodness, guys. I mean, this is the kind of world we're living in. We don't even know history. We don't even know how people suffered and died for us. It's not just about Christ who did that. Now, he's obviously the most important. He's the inspiration for all of it, right? He is Lord and God, so he inspired us. We follow in his footsteps. And is that really what we're doing when we make like the kind of content we've been making? It's not about the deep issues of life, and as it comes to conservative entertainment, I don't think it's much better. People are convinced, right, that the people who defy a government and aren't all about governmental power, conservatives are convinced that it's the governmental power that's most important. That's really what we're fighting for. It's all about politics and documentaries. Changing the government is what it's all about. Getting power in the government is all what it's about. No, it's not. No, it's not. That's the stuff that matters. It's not politics that matters. It's really having the freedom to worship Christ. And guess what? You have it, even if you're behind the Iron Curtain. So that's what they're trying to tell people back there. No, you have the freedom to do that. So now they realize through art, and we're gonna talk about how our culture can change its thinking about what we're doing. We've been told that we have to just make counter statements against Hollywood. We have to make counter statements against what the political people that we don't like are saying. We just have to give a counter message to that. No, absolutely not. What we need to do is listen to the Holy Spirit, see, feel, hear his beauty, right? And express that to the world. And that's done through art. It's done by making great stuff that is true, good, and beautiful. And also, there's another thing here. There's another aspect to this that many people are not getting, but it's so obviously profound, okay? If you understand what the gospel means, right, which is that Christ, who from the foundation of the world elected us, and then he died for us so that we can live, because we can't do it on our own, right? We don't have the righteousness in ourselves to follow the law and to please God. We just can't do that. So who can do it? Christ can do it. That's the good news, the gospel, is that you don't have to do it. But what you do have to do is fall in love with Christ, and that means obey his commandments, right? And so you make him your Lord, you follow his commandments, and now guess what? Amazingly, you can follow his law. It's amazing how that works. It really is an empowering thing when you have a relationship with God. It empowers you. It's like the bride of a king has some power, kind of like she does, right? If that bride honors the king, everybody sees that. And then when she speaks, it's like the king is speaking. So it's not like we can't do things at all. But guess what? We can't without him. And that's the truth. So when we have him, and there's that loving relationship between us and Christ, we actually have power over sin. We really do. So sure, you might have to believe it first, but read scripture. It says he empowers you to do these things. So your love for him empowers you to do that. And love is a better motivator than fear of hell. So loving him and loving that he's bringing you into his kingdom empowers you more than being scared of hell. And that relationship really frees you to do the things you always wanted to do, which is just to live in beautiful bounty with God, not to be running around, oh no, I did this bad thing. You see, now you don't have to worry about that. And you'll find that when you go to him in repentance, he's very gracious to you. That's why you don't have to worry about it anymore, because your heart has become a heart of flesh, no longer of stone. And so when you break God's heart, you feel it. And you go, I don't want that. I don't want to break his heart. So because my heart is now flesh, I repent and I say I'm sorry. And it's actually not that hard to do if your heart is a heart of flesh. But it is an impossible thing to do when your heart is made of stone, right? So this is human effort. Our human effort steps in, and we try to make a heart of stone have feelings, and we just can't do it. It doesn't have feelings, doesn't care. So in between bouts of gospel truth, I will tell you how then Christians and conservatives can make a difference through the culture. It is by understanding the gospel. So as you understand the gospel, which is in the Bible, right? This is a story. I still wish that we have had an illuminated manuscript, because I still think it would be the coolest thing to just be like, it's in this story, and there's like an illuminated manuscript here. I'm talking about the Bible.
Yeah.
And so we should think about getting one in our bookstore if possible. But the Bible has stories in it that are incredible. They're like mythological. They're like legendary. We still tell them today in films. We still tell them today to our kids. We still tell them today in churches around the globe. And they are powerfully life-changing stories. So as you start to see Christ and the gospel, not just in the New Testament, But in the Old Testament, you'll kind of get blown away. As long as you're not part of like a weird culty part of the church where they see things that aren't there in the Bible, as long as you're not part of one of those churches, you're going to start seeing things that are kind of mind-blowing. Because just like how Isaiah 53 talks about Christ, it talks about Christ on the cross and all this stuff, I think that was told 400 years before Christ, something like that. There's other parts in the Old Testament as well that talk of Christ, and you'll just be blown away when you start noticing them. And so this kind of reading between the lines of stories, this kind of demythologizing stories, or rather often the opposite, enchanting of stories, where a story that seems on its face just to be pretty plain, like Jonah, right? Okay, Jonah is not actually incredibly plain, but the cool thing about it is Christ in Christ's day, he says, I'll give you the sign of Jonah. He's talking about a bunch of stuff, right? And then other people are talking about Jonah as well. And one of those things in which are the fact that he was 3 days in the belly of the whale, and that's speaking of Christ. So there's many prophets in the past, hundreds of years before Christ, that the things that they did and went through have to do with Christ hundreds of years in the future. And this is not to confuse you or say, why is this important? Like, what's the relevance? Are you just reading into that? No, the Bible literally tells you that that's what it's doing. So why would God do this? Let's just say this is actually a historical document. So why would God do this? Why would God put things back in the past? They're just little tiny nuggets and symbols of things in the future. So that when Christ came, you know it's him. So that when you're thinking about if Christ is God, you know that he is. How are we going to know who he is based on that? Well, the idea is that God himself orchestrated symbols in the past so that they would relate to the future, so that you would know Christ when he came. Because only God could do that. Only God could do that. Only a God that lives transcendent of time, which is how God lives. In other words, he's currently living in the past right now and the future right now, which I know it's mind-blowing, but it's also so beautiful just to think that. But that's God. And this is what makes God never changing makes sense. The fact that he never changes, he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. That's not a matter of him being stubborn, okay? Or something like that. Or unable to change. Well, I would change, but I just can't. No, that's because he's literally living at every time in history right now. So if there was anything he could learn and change into, he would have already had done that. Because he's already been there. But he doesn't need to do that because he's already been there. And he's already perfect anyway. So it's kind of wonderful and beautiful and also mind melting at the same time, which is how you know you're jumping into something divine. It's not some kind of drug use. No, I'm not talking about that kind of brain melting. You people think I'm talking about something else. I'm not talking about the nature of God, right? So here we get to it. The gospel and storytelling. The fact that God does this with his stories means that he has his hand in so many stories in history. It means he has his hand in orchestrating so many stories in history. And why does he do it? To reveal the gospel. And he does it in your life if you're a Christian, and my life too. So he's telling the gospel not just through Jonah, not just through Job, not just through Hosea, not just through Ezekiel, but through you and me. And that's pretty cool. And so what I see as a storyteller is that when you look at cool stories, the best cool stories do the same thing. They also reveal Christ through that story. And the best heroes already do that. And we all actually kind of know that already. We already kind of know that the best heroes, whether it's Superman or Spider-Man or Robin Hood or the Scottish dude who's like, our freedom. William, what's his name? I was going to say Wilberforce. He's another character that came later. But so there's these different characters through history, right? And Joseph, right? He's a big one. Moses, so many that mirror Christ in so many ways. And why would it be Christ and not someone else? Because there's nobody greater. That's why.
Yeah.
So if you want your story to have just a piece of the greatest story ever written, you want to be like Christ, right? And like Jonah, even outside of your will, he's just being dragged along the whole time. And he can't help but mirror Christ, right? Because he is still a man of God who believes in God. He believes in God's holiness. That's why he doesn't like the Ninevites. You see, this is why God accepts Jonah, even though Jonah's disobedient. Because Jonah actually does know God. He does understand God. He knows God's holiness. That's what's most important to Jonah. This is why he doesn't like the Ninevites, like I said. But God is also merciful, and he loves people. So we can't forget those qualities. That's why Jonah is a great story, and it mirrors Christ, because it's not just holiness, it's also his mercy. And so Jonah gets kind of not made a fool of exactly, but kind of, oh, Jonah, you're so silly. Now you're upset that the vine is wilting, right? So these are like many people we've known in real life who are good people deep in their heart, but they're just, they're kind of annoyed by those people down the street. They want them to be punished, but God is going to still work through them, right? So these are great stories. And do you see, though, a lot of this kind of nuance in today's stories? Because for the most part, I don't, especially not in Hollywood. You know, the reason I mentioned two superheroes is because those are the most recent kind of Hollywood stories that actually did retain some of this gospel, just a little bit of gospel vibe in there, because they're superheroes, right? And superheroes are supposed to be the apex of the human being. They're supposed to be great people who do great things, people we admire, people that are aspirational, right? Which is why they can't do it today, why superheroes just they don't work today, because Hollywood is not aspirational anymore. So they're missing each of these little aspects of Christ they're going to lose. The more they lose these truths, they're just going to lose each of these little aspects. And then their stories are going to have no value, none whatsoever. But who should be knowing this more than anybody? This is conservatives who believe in conservative stories that are stories as old as dirt that survive. Conservatives should be championing these kinds of stories, or Christians. And instead, what are we getting? The greatest football team ever to have lived in 1978 or something. Or they're going to have a documentary on some kind of political issue. Wow, this is so epic. We're going to remember this in 20 years, 50 years. Boy, we're all going to remember that moment, which is just like one of 100 moments this year in politics in the 24-hour news cycle. Just poof, like smoke, it's gone in like 5 minutes. Everyone forgets about it. The political news cycle is incredibly fickle. It just comes and goes. It's like they're just making money, right? It's not actually about real issues. That's what it seems like. And faith-based stuff and Christian stuff should at least be more timeless values, because at least we have some belief in our faith and we go to church every Sunday. You'd think that we would start emulating some of these values in our stories, not just the greatest football team in 1978 or something like that. Sure, like I said, there are a few okay autobiographical, biographical stories. I also was going to mention the fact that some of our great masterpieces of art we've made in Christendom, which you can find, by the way, in this book, 75 Masterpieces Every Christian Should Know. We talked about this a few episodes back, but we can get into this a little bit again at some point. But this has all kinds of different masterpieces, not just films, right? It has visual works, paintings, it has songs, it has sonatas, it has even cathedrals, in this, which are honest to God pieces of art. And films, of course, albums, music albums, things like that in here. Some of the things they mentioned are old hymns, and these are great works of art as well. Amazing Grace is the name not only of a great old hymn, but I think John Newton, I think is his name, at the time of abolition, right? The abolition movement against slavery in England. Amazing Grace is also a film about that story. Not just about the hymn, but about that period in history of abolition. And so as we read about these great stories in history, like you're reading the Bible and reading about Jonah, you can do what? Distill the gospel out of it. And as you distill the gospel out of it, the song Amazing Grace is not just about a song anymore. It's not just about those chords and those lyrics that were so meaningful to John Newton or so meaningful to Wilberforce and to the abolition movement. No, they're meaningful to us, and they're not just meaningful to us as a song. They're meaningful to us as it comes to the story of these folks' lives and the difference that they made in the abolition movement, which is the difference they made to hundreds of thousands of people, giving them life, giving them the right to life in not just England, but the U.S. as well, and around the world. England then started abolishing the slave trade around the world, just imposing their will on other people and saying, nope, no more slave trade. Does this hurt your feelings? Does this bother you? Good. So we can impose our will on others. Why? Why can we do that? Because it's God's will, right? Do you think God wants these folks to be enslaved? Absolutely not. So all of this is a really important time in history where we kind of got it. We kind of understood how the law works. If it's in obedience and love to God, it's a good law. And if it's not really, God doesn't like that stuff, maybe you should make a law against that. That just kind of makes sense, doesn't it? So then you start reading the Old Testament, you start realizing a lot of the people that hate on Christianity, they haven't even read it. They don't even know what it says. They just make claims. The Bible was against slavery back in the Old Testament too, right? So it was against mistreating women, it was against slavery, it was against mistreating foreigners, it was against all these things. We just ignore it. We just lie about it. We say it's evil and the Christians are evil because they're not Christians, obviously. Doesn't that make sense? Of course they're going to hate on you. They're not a Christian. Does that surprise you? No. But the fact is they're just wrong about it. They're just wrong about it. They don't get it. And I went off on this tirade about what? One song, Amazing Grace. You see how it works? There's so much more there than just a song. It taps into a deep human well of emotion. It taps into deep truths when you get into it. So that's what artists need to do. What if people took this story about Wurmbrand, who gave his life, and attached a song to it, and then attached a larger story to it? And all of these stories were related, not through some kind of manufactured thing, but through some organic understanding of the truth about what God's trying to tell us through this story, which is really through the story of Christ and the gospel. So really you have to see this through the gospel. And as you see these stories through the gospel, they make more sense, not less sense. They become revealed as eternal truths, not just products of their time, and that makes them conservative and timeless. Do you understand? That's why they become timeless, because they use timeless truths to make them valuable, to make them relevant. And so as these things, like, here's another one, Stephen Lawhead's Taliesin, this is the Pendragon Cycle. This is an Arthurian legend. And he's just using some historical facts in here to make it a more interesting story. Same kind of timeless truths in the Arthurian legend, right? It's not as overtly Christian, right, as Wurmbrand, but both can be seen through the gospel to shed new light on an old story, right? New light through an old story. That old story might have made sense to someone back in, 800 AD in England, or 1000 AD, right? Or 1300 at the height of the Middle Ages. But through Christ, it makes sense to us eternally, right? So this is why the gospel is a lens to view all great myth through. And so as you understand how to unpack those truths in the Bible, you're going to understand how to unpack those truths in art and literature, right? So you're going to understand like why Hosea did what he did, why Ezekiel did what he did, why Jeremiah did what he did. And by understanding that, you're going to be able to understand all these other stories, all these other great masterpieces of literature. And then if God has blessed you to be a filmmaker, you're going to start getting imagery from that. You're going to start getting scenes and characters from that. You're going to see the scenes and characters, ways of seeing these stories in ways you never thought of before. For example, after maybe the third time I had read Job, second or third time, I started to see Job, like the second time I read it, I started to see Job in modern lights. I started to see him like, what if he was a modern person and this kind of same thing was happening. But a lot of the examples given in the story of Job don't make as much sense if you do that. Like God talking about Leviathan, God talking about all these other animals that God created, the cultural backdrop that his the position from which his friends are coming with Job doesn't make sense today. It doesn't make as much sense. They come from a place, a time in Asia in which debating about these things made sense. And we just don't live in a time like that. Our modern time does not debate in that way, where it thinks it's helping and assisting a friend, and so debating with him for days and days and days. That's an old, ancient Asian way of dealing with difficulty. In fact, that people today just, I don't think they even do it at all. I don't think they understand it. Here's another story. Modern. This one's more modern. I don't mean modern philosophically, obviously. I mean in the modern day. Andrew Peterson's Wing Feather. When you see a story like this, which makes you think of something like C.S. Lewis, Chronicles of Narnia, Tolkien maybe, other stories with kids in difficult situations in kind of a strange medieval time. This is also very funny and cute. But when you see this kind of story through the gospel, it's really cool. I think it gives it color. It just gives it beauty. But when you don't, it's kind of like just fun, right? When you don't think of it that way, it's just fun. But there are stories, and I think this is actually one of them. I should take that back. This isn't just fun. Stories like Lord of the Rings and this, when characters are put through enough difficulty and trial and tribulation, sometimes the only thing that makes sense is to see it through the gospel. And if you don't, you don't understand it. And that's the beautiful thing about stories like these. Lord of the Rings and this one, and there's some other ones too. Without the gospel, all the suffering and pain doesn't make sense. You're left with something similar to what you have in real life, right? Which is suffering and pain. You don't know, you can't make sense of it all, like in real life. Even if you go to your pastor and talk about it, not much more sense can be made of it. You go to your family or friends and it doesn't really do much. But if you go to God, guess what? It changes it. So that's why stories like this matter. I would read it. It's enjoyable also. It's not just suffering, but it's cool stuff. And that's another level of story, I think, where it's not just fun and entertainment, and it's not just very straightforward messaging like this was bad, don't do this thing, right? Like that's kind of like this, right? This was bad. Evil governments are evil, and sometimes people have to suffer for those situations. It's not always as straightforward as that, because we know why he's suffering, right? We don't know why the hobbits are suffering in Lord of the Rings. It just doesn't, like it feels senseless, Here's another one I would take a second look at. If anybody has ever heard of this, Rick Joyner's The Final Quest. He's got a few of these, and he says things like, this was a vision I had. I'm not as interested in that kind of thing. Someone who says they had a vision. Like I would just say, write it and don't even tell anybody. But like this is, it's good, but it's good as in strange. It's strange, but strange in a good way, I should say. Where it's kind of like the strange suffering we were talking about, but it's all allegorical for today's time, where you're thinking, who are these strange people? What are these strange situations? Well, this symbolizes this, and this symbolizes that, and that symbolizes that. And that means very hard to swallow truths about our current age, right? Like, for example, it's the church harming the church is a big theme here. our modern American church harming the church is in here. And why is that happening? But it's a story of bravery. It's a story of fighting for God, even when so much of life doesn't make sense. And it's got some cool medieval themes and some magic-y things in there. It's kind of cool. I like it. Speaking of magic, there's always Frank Peretti, who I think is eminently useful when you're talking about the spirit world, and you maybe doubt that the spirit world is matters to you or is real. When you start reading his work, you start realizing, no, it actually seems very real. It actually seems like it's relevant to your life. And shockingly so, in the sense of Screwtape Letters being shockingly relevant, because part of the theme is, well, if you don't think it's relevant, that's exactly why it's relevant, because you're being tricked to think you shouldn't think it's relevant by the people who benefit the most when you don't think it's relevant. In other words, it's an introduction to the deception of dark evil forces and how they want to deceive you about the fact that this, and make you believe that the spirit world doesn't matter to you. And actually, it matters quite a bit. But here's the beautiful elegance of that. You don't have to be obsessed by the spirit world after you start realizing it matters. No, you're supposed to realize it matters enough to let God handle it for you. You have to trust God with that too, because you realize what? You can't do it without him. And it is important, it is relevant, but then it's something else that you have to put in God's hands. And if you can do that, then you don't have to worry about it. But one issue is that it could become an obsession that's not altogether healthy. That's not a good thing. As a Christian, you realize it's real, but that also God is in charge of all these things. So that's really the best way to handle it. But what I want to get to too is I really wish conservatives they would understand. Here's one called Shadows and Chivalry. And this is about C.S. Lewis and George MacDonald and other writers and how they're talking about chivalry and suffering and kind of like goodness and how to handle suffering through kind of the goodness of chivalric living, if that makes any sense, or the chivalric outlook on life. So a lot of the stuff in here is about kind of philosophy, but and sometimes a chivalric view of God and of philosophy. Like there's one chapter in here on the philosophy of hell. I think they talk about Dante's Inferno a little bit in there. Death, other challenges we deal with, right? Land of Shadows. So they deal with different themes that are the difficult things that we deal with in life, right? And they talk about how these authors and their stories deal with these subjects through a very kind of traditional Christian view, but also a view that we've kind of forgotten about today. And how we really deal with difficulty, this kind of gives tools to do that. Shadows and Chivalry. So I like a lot of the George MacDonald segments because I, again, think he's highly underestimated as an author. Especially dealing with subjects we're talking about now. Here's another one which talks about more great authors and their work, Christian myth makers. So on the cover it says C.S. Lewis, Madeline L'Engle, Tolkien, George MacDonald, G.K. Chesterton, and others. Some of the others are other Inklings. Who was the other Inklings? Again, I forgot. Charles Williams, I believe. Owen Barfield. In here, they talk about Charles Williams. They talk about John Bunyan as well, of course, wrote Pilgrim's Progress, and a few others. But this is great because it does talk about the nature of myth, and it talks about the greatness of their work. So if instead of reading all this other work, you'd like to read about them first to see their value, check this one out, Christian Myth Makers by Roland Hine. And because we're recommending books, right? This one is The Seven Masterpieces I mentioned before, but it's by Terry Glaspie, Glaspey. And it does talk about some incredible works of art in Christendom throughout the ages. Like, for example, Franz Joseph Haydn's The Creation. I didn't even know about before this. Which is just an oratorio. I've never heard it. Songs of Innocence and Experience by William Blake. Now, this recommendation by William Blake gives me pause about this book. So this might not be this from your Christian denomination, but William Blake was a little bit of a hermeticist, non-Christian, but he used Christian themes, right? So you do have to be careful about some of these recommendations because William Blake was a bit of a loony. If you look at any of his work, you'll be like, that's weird, because it is weird. He comes from a time period in which you're going from the Regency era into the Romantics in the late 1800s. And this was a time in which Industrial Revolution was overwhelming the Western world, not just literally as it comes to jobs and the wealth it represented, but also the human cruelty it represented, and also the breakup of the family and the breakup of farm life. And so the Industrial Revolution really represented a colossal philosophical change to the Western world. And so the Romantics were an attempt to return humankind to nature and make us see the grandeur of nature. The problem, of course, is that they should have been leading people towards the grandeur of God again. And instead, they were leading people to the idea of nature without God. And of course, this happened because Charles Darwin came before the Romantics. And he put something in the water. He kind of poisoned the well for Christians. So by the time Christians wanted God back and wanted community back, they couldn't do it. They had to retreat into nature. So this was, while the Romantics were amazing and great, and I bring this up right because William Blake was kind of a precursor to the Romantics. William Blake raged against the Industrial Revolution, but kind of from a psychological, philosophical, and prophetic perspective about the future of mankind if we don't escape the Industrial Revolution. And he was very concerned about England in particular and the survival of England. But that was happening all around Europe. And in a way, Marxism was the same thing. It was a product of a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. So there's many good things that came from that and many bad things. Reactions, G.K. Chesterton, in a way, famously was also against the Industrial Revolution, but his solution to it was the family. And that's a far better solution than just retreating to nature or retreating to some kind of pastoral existence that you remember from 50 years ago, or some kind of idea that things should return back to normal because it's too tumultuous now. This is not enough. What people really needed to do was something more like George MacDonald did. He was, in a way, a romantic, but he actually did not lead people to nature whatsoever. He led people to fairy tales and the divine within the fairy tales. And so he was leading people to God, which is the correct answer. There is just really no healing from the Industrial Revolution without God. You just can't heal from it. And what happens after the Romantics? The modernists and Marxists and all of this, and war and death and killing. And then the belief that we can be like God, and superheroes come after that, right? To where we believe that that's the apex. We can kind of mutate somehow into this superhuman Ubermensch, and that we can create our own purpose like Nietzsche and Camus proposed. And these modernist thinkers were leading us into disillusionment and nihilism. They weren't really providing you an answer. And so now you have Elon Musk that wants to send us to Mars and have us listen to whatever AI says and believing that we'll all become rich. What does this have to do with our problems? Nothing. Has nothing to do with it. And it's not going to solve our problems. Not to be such a skeptic about his highly technocratic views about the world. It's true that William Blake, this reactionary, is not providing us with answers, but Elon Musk isn't either. You need people like George MacDonald, right, who can re-enchant us into myth again, into the meaning in these stories, which is really the gospel, right? Fairy tale is often the gospel in them. And there's a reason for that. There's often more meaning in the magical than in the technology, right? I mean, that's why the idea of the ghost in the machine kind of works in our brain, because we think it's the ghost we're really seeking. It's not the machine. And that's true. The question is, what kind of ghost are we talking about? Are we talking about AI, which is just the appearance of a ghost, the Turing test? It looks like it's acting human, and so therefore it must be. No, that's not how that works. Just because something has the outer appearance of appearing good does not mean it's good on the inside, right? So, and does not mean there's a real thing there staring back at you. You're probably seeing yourself darkened in your own mirror in AI. So the darkness of humanity just mirrors back to us through AI, but it's not really our solution. So let's go over then some of the stuff we've learned. We learned there's different kinds of stories, but all those stories, if we look at them through the lens of the gospel and of Christ and of the greatest examples of good living and good and of love and of strength that we can find, we're going to find meaning in our stories. We're going to find conservative Western civilizational values that really matter to most people, right? And so where can we find these stories? And why does this matter? It matters, again, just like how I mentioned in the beginning of this talk, that what we're seeing now is not a lot of great stories coming from faith-based or from conservative media. I mean, I will bring up one exception right now, but are there any other ones that you can think of, Rebecca, that are really, really good?
You're talking about faith-based media. I mean, The Passion of the Christ.
Yeah, 20 years ago, right?
Yeah.
25 years ago, maybe now? You know, there's some stuff on Angel that's not too bad. We mentioned the Wingfeather Saga, right? That's pretty decent. The Wayfarers seems decent. Let's see. There's probably a few other places, really small places. They're not coming out of Hollywood. They're not coming out of anything that normal television is making, anything on broadcast or on cable or anything like that. There's things in little circles, in little oases on the internet where people are trying to build something. We've talked about a few of them on Media Moses, St. George, for example. These little places where people are doing small things. Lord TV is trying to do some of these small projects. And here's the exception that I was going to mention. I brought the book Pendragon Cycle, right? So this has a bit of a mythopoeic quality to it, right? It's true it has some true history in it, but it also has some totally made up stuff. Like they talk about Atlantis in it. And obviously this is kind of about the beginnings, right, of King Arthur. And so King Arthur is a fictional person, but he kind of represents a very real thing that happened in Brittany at the time, Britannia, is that they needed to unite against the Viking warlords and form their own kind of national identity in a way, right? Cultural identity. And so like they were in many ways a very diverse group of people there. And those people could, I think, then start uniting against any other foreign invaders. And it's kind of about how nations are formed in a way. That's kind of like what the story of King Arthur is about how nations are formed, how a people can identify can identify themselves and what they're about and why what they're about matters. King Arthur is just kind of like an embodiment of those values. And so the Pendragon Cycle, is coming out by the Daily Wire pretty soon in January. So about 2 months or so from now. And it's got potential. If it's interpreted well on the screen, then it could be a modern mythopoeic story because it's got Christianity in it too. It's not just about England and about King Arthur. And in a way, this story seems more true than many of the other legends of King Arthur because it does include the Christian element where many of the others don't. And if they do include the Christian element, it's just kind of like symbols, but not real Christian values, right? So like they're searching for the Holy Grail, but what does that mean? Right? And are they really going to be valiant and good and brave? Or are they just going to, try to achieve some cool stuff, you know? And so this is really about that. It's about the values as well, and about how Christianity is different from paganism. That's a really important theme here. A lot of people don't know about with Pendragon. It literally is about the difference between paganism and Christianity on a values level. And a lot of people don't know that. But that's what this story is really about. It's about why Christianity and why not paganism. So in a way, England was founded on that concept. No, Christianity can hold us together and paganism cannot hold us together anymore. It's a worthless value system. So this is better. And that's kind of what it's about. And I really value that. There's many other stories like that, legendary, mythical stories in our history. Obviously, the Bible is kind of the lens to understand all of these. So the Bible is foundational. And many of them, like I mentioned, Jonah, there's one of them. You could just start latching on to any one of these stories to start unpacking them and seeing Christ through them. And then you'll start to see Christ in Beowulf. You'll start to see Christ in the Divine Comedy. You'll start to see Christ in the stories of the saints and their myths. You'll start to see Christ in King Arthur, in William Shakespeare. You'll see him in Pilgrim's Progress. Obviously, it's far more overt by that time. You'll see him in The Fairy Queen. I'm kind of going through history here. So from the past to the present, these are conservative stories. And so many conservatives can get behind them, many Christians can get behind them. And bringing these stories back to life, the only way you can bring them back to life is through timeless values. And the only way you can do that is by understanding that Christ is the lens, the gospel is the lens by which to see these timeless values, right? And the only way you can start to understand that is by reading the Bible more, like I said. So let's go through some more of them. As we go closer to modern, right, we mentioned like some of the early hymns, like Amazing Grace. There's other things like Handel's Messiah. There's Johann Sebastian's work. Johann Sebastian Bach, probably the greatest composer in history, actually. Then you have people like John Milton, who brings back the epic poetry through Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. And then I mentioned George MacDonald before. He is a re-enchanter of great mythic stories and fairy tales. And so we need more of his stuff. And he's got 50 stories that could be brought back to life. He's not just like Tolkien and Lewis who have like a good 5 stories. No, he's got like 50 of them and they're all beautiful. So some of them are more like dramas, which could be like, a lot of women could like them because some of them have romantic elements to it or dramatic or novel type elements to it. But then his fairy tale stories are very heroic and definitely for boys. Fantastes is like totally for men, young men. Lilith of Romance is incredible. It's about death and dealing with death and seeing Christ, the beauty of Christ through death, and making sense of your life through all of that. Dayboy and Night Girl is like a romance. And The Light Princess is a beautiful story for girls to learn to take life more seriously. Man, George MacDonald has a ton of great stuff. Then you get more into the modern era and you get people like Dostoevsky, the brothers Karamazov, stories like this that have a lot of great meaning and value to them. You have I mentioned G.K. Chesterton before. His stuff can be really good. Gerard Manley Hopkins, his poetry. T.S. Eliot, his poetry. C.S. Lewis, obviously. Tolkien. There's Hind's Feet in High Places. There's Heidi, even is good. And you'll see Heidi. It's sure a lot of it's for kids, maybe even for girls, but it's like really good values are in them. Like stuff like Little House on the Prairie is like that, right? Stuff like that is needed for kids today because they think that they just pull out their tablet and play a video game. They're getting quality time. No, like these stories are about doing hard things. Like one great story from George MacDonald's At the Back of the North Wind, because it's about this little kid, Diamond, who experiences hardship at a young age, and then he has great wisdom. And he doesn't even know he has great wisdom, and that doesn't even matter. And yet he affects the lives of people around him. These are great stories. Like that's 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 important to teach kids that they can do great things, and they don't have to be big-headed about it or try to get adventure every 5 minutes and be great, and wield swords. Like you don't have to do that to be great. Let's see, what other stories. Oh yeah, obviously there's filmmakers like Andrei Tarkovsky, who's does incredible work. Solzhenitsyn, who wrote about the Gulag Archipelago in communist Russia, and the Iron Curtain, and he talks about truth and the value of Christian communities and how you can defeat evil through Christian communities. Um, some of these are more light entertainmenty, but I'm not into entertainment personally. And I think a lot of people don't understand that today. They think Hollywood equals entertainment. No, I'm here to talk about culture. I'm here to talk about things that matter. I'm here to talk about things like life and death, things that young men find value in and purpose, a reason to live. Entertainment is not a reason to live. It's just not. And we talked about this more recently, honey, didn't we? The movie Sorcerer, right? From the late 70s, 77. William Friedkin, the maker of The Exorcist, makes this great film, Sorcerer. It's highly misunderstood. It's panned by critics. It comes out at the same time as Star Wars, and therefore it becomes a box office dud. But guess what? Sorcerer represented a now long gone era of American filmmaking in which we cared about art. And art is about real values. William Friedkin said his film was about fate. And so artists used to talk about this kind of stuff. They used to care about this kind of stuff. And they were trying to inculcate values into the public consciousness, trying to get people to think about deep subjects. They thought that was valuable. They thought art mattered because art can teach you about life. It can have beauty in it, inherent in it, just embedded in it. And that makes it valuable. That makes it worth your time. It's like you eat a strong meal. You've got like all the different courses of your meal there, and you go home and you're not hungry. You feel satiated because you've understood something extra about life. This is the kind of stuff that matters to people. They don't want to just waste their time on frivolous matters. They want to see something that really gives their life meaning. And so Sorcerer, sure, it's about fate. It's about these evil men who suffer for their deeds. And are they going to survive through that? And so it asks difficult questions. It's sometimes a difficult movie to get through, but it's also very thrilling. It's very interesting. It's beautiful. It's beautifully shot. And then what happens? The same year, Star Wars comes out, and Hollywood realizes it can make millions and billions of dollars on what? Art? No, on entertainment, on blockbustery, spectacular spectacle, right? And this is bread and circuses kind of stuff. Yes, I'm not going to sit here and say Star Wars doesn't have meaning, doesn't have values in it. It isn't great stuff, but that's not the lesson that Hollywood learned from it. And that's the problem. The problem is not that Star Wars was a bad movie. Not whatsoever. Star Wars was great. The problem is that our culture changed in the wrong direction because we believed the blockbuster model was the greatest thing ever, and franchise-itis sets in, and sequelitis sets in Hollywood, and then it's all about established IP. And then it's all about repeated works over and over and over. Nothing original, nothing new. And what is lost in all of that? Well, art is lost in all of that. The value of art, right? The value of an auteur director who has something to say through his art form. And so instead, what we get is the George Lucases, right, who have a canon, and they talk about, the Bible of Star Wars and what's important, and all these little books and fan works are made from it. It's all about IP. It's all about just digging into this IP, and this gives Hollywood a disease. And the disease becomes not about ideas and about beauty of storytelling. It becomes about chasing the almighty dollar through the blockbuster model because it was so lucrative and so beneficial to the theatrical model in Hollywood. They could keep going with theaters. They could make billions of dollars, not just through theaters, through merchandising and all these other things, video games, all this other stuff that came after Star Wars, right? Sure, it's brilliant. Sure, you can make a lot of money doing it. But what gets lost in the mix? All of these great stories, Blade Runner came out not soon after. Blade Runner also was one of the only great artistic sci-fi films. Just piece of art. It's about life. It's not about just cool visuals. The visuals are powerful and great, but it's about life. It's about what makes a human being a human being. Why does that matter, right? So this kind of art gets lost. And why is that? Because the public is not being taught to appreciate it by the curators. Guess who are the ones who hated Sorcerer the most? The curators, the reviewers said, what a big waste of time that was, because they're not thinking about the fact of that art has value to society. They're thinking of, did I enjoy that? And you still hear the same junk today from curators who are not good curators. They're thinking about if they enjoyed the film or not, if it massaged their ego enough for their own political beliefs or something. No joke. That's what they think about. And obviously, different curators have different values, but it's all about a subjective view of did they enjoy this film or not. It's a big waste of your time if you're listening to curators who are talking about that. A big waste of time. Famously, Paulina, I think her name was Paulina Kael, such a highly influential curator, reviewer from the late 70s, early 80s, I think. And her value system is so screwed up. She doesn't even have a value system. She always comes off like she does, but it's really more about politics. I think she also called Dirty Harry fascistic. You see what I mean? We've been dealing with this accusation that anything on the right wing is fascistic since the 70s. This is not anything new from these kinds of people. They're not really into enriching our culture with the arts, right? What they're really into is cheapening Hollywood and making it into propaganda that they enjoy, right? They enjoy the propaganda, actually. That's really what they want. So this is a destruction of the value system in Hollywood. This is beginning in the late 70s. So the apex for cinema is an art form. And the art form teaches values, beauty, goodness, truth. It's not about making you feel good, right? It's about giving you difficult nutrition in a meal, right? Eating your broccoli. And so as kids start to value that, they're experiencing the apex of what art can be, of what cinema can be, right? And so you have to learn to appreciate. It takes time to learn to appreciate difficult things like that. It's difficult. And you have to unpack it. And the more you do, guess what? That's work. And the more you do that, guess what? That's valuable. It actually has value. And when a curator knows how to draw that value out of it, guess what they just did? They did a day's work. And that day's work is worth you reading their stupid article on it. But if they don't do that, guess what? You just wasted your time. Because they didn't digest all that out for you and explain it to you in a rational, reasonable way. So curators go into this as well, right? The curation of that time period, people were telling people in the public, don't watch Sorcerer, instead watch blockbuster entertainment, right? That's what they started to tell you. And that's what we got as a result. And it's true that we fell for it. Hollywood made a lot more money that way because it's the blockbuster model. But guess what happens then? Entertainment becomes the highest value of film. That's the apex. And what does that really mean? How do you judge entertainment value? I liked it, and it made a ton of money at the box office. That's how you judge it. And that's what became the primary judge for what films were good in Hollywood. When you look at the trades, when you look at the news and what people are saying, they say, well, how much did it make at the box office? And did you enjoy it when you watched it? Do you think that they want to talk about, did it have values in it? Is it good for society? Is it making your neighborhood feel safer at night? I don't know. Or does it benefit your community in some way? No, they're not talking about that. They don't care about that stuff. They want to know if Hollywood's making money. This becomes their worth. This becomes the worth of the filmmaker if they can make Hollywood money. Does that have anything to do with art and being an auteur and making good work? No, nothing. So if they can be like a filmmaker like James Cameron who can make Alien into Aliens and make a good amount of money, or honor the IP and make the IP money and then make the studio money from that, that's what matters to them, right? And then guess what the next stage was? It became propaganda. It became about an ideology after that. And that's more recently. But in the 80s, it started to become this sequelitis thing, right? Franchise-itis, IP, blockbusters, right? And we've been doing that since more recently with superheroes. So this has not been a good journey. It's going downhill. I think we can all sense that, right? Hollywood's quality is going downhill. Why? Because we've been losing our values. What makes cinema work as an art form, right? Why go? What's the value there? What are you getting out of it? And so we're losing all that. We've lost the value of it, you know? You shouldn't have to go to cinema to get a sermon. I'm not saying you should be getting necessarily Christianized or preached at when you go, when you go to a theater. But there are values that matter. And they're unifying Western civilizational values that matter. And those are the ones like I was talking about in William Friedkin's Sorcerer, fate. These are like things that the Greeks thought about a lot as well. And Christianity as well, right? We have this concept of the sovereignty of God and whether God's in charge of everything or whether we have free will. That's always a deeply important subject, I think, to the human being. So I think that's really a great discussion to be had. What other things have we left out? There's some stuff more recently as well. And so are there any stories that you think I left out? Maybe I didn't emphasize enough, Rebecca?
No, I think you did a good job emphasizing.
Okay. I mean, sure, there's some stories like Paradise Lost. I could talk about a great deal. I could talk more about Frank Peretti's This Present Darkness. I could talk about some of C.S. Lewis's stuff like his Cosmic Trilogy. Some people call it his Ransom Trilogy. There's great stuff there. I've said this before, but the fact that we are not pursuing making works like this is really shameful. It's disturbingly shameful. And if we are doing it, it's like Netflix bought the rights to C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. And then what do you think is going to happen to that? Do you think Netflix respects Western civilizational values? No, they're trying to destroy them. So they're not going to champion C.S. Lewis's legacy, least of all his Christianity at all. So that's the first thing that's going to take the hit. If people who are supposed to safeguard our Western civilizational values and our myths don't do that and aren't faithful to doing that, they're betraying our entire civilization. They're throwing it to the dogs. They're throwing pearls to swine so they can get a few bucks. Like, it's really disgusting. It disturbs me when you hear of this kind of thing happening with C.S. Lewis and Netflix. They're the worst. They're as bad as Disney. So they don't represent our culture. They don't represent our values. They represent newfangled ideas that have been around for 5 minutes, and they're sold out to them as propaganda. They're not into our long-lasting conservative cultural values, which really are just about Western civilization. But I guess I'll end it there, but there's places you can go to find more stories like this. One of the places I love online is called Lorehaven, They have a great podcast as well where they talk about stories. They were just talking about monsters during the holiday season. And so they're always talking about relevant subjects. And often they are mentioning some more contemporary stories that are just coming out. So they're always talking about the latest Christian authors who are putting out specifically speculative fiction work. So anything like Tolkien and Lewis is the stuff they'd be talking about if they were around in the 60s or 70s. They'd be talking about Tolkien and Lewis. Now they're talking about more modern authors. We mentioned Andrew Peterson and S.D. Smith. Well, they talk about those guys. Because speculative fiction is really, obviously it's fiction, but it's often includes genres such as horror, or it includes sci-fi or fantasy, things like that. So the best kind of fiction, really. Um, so we love that stuff, and they've always got some new author or some new thing they're talking about. So you go to lorehaven.com. They also I think that the guys who run Lorehaven also have their own publishing house I think it's called Realm Publishing. And speaking of Realm Publishing, they do Realm Makers Expo and Conference every year. And I was at their last one up in Grand Rapids, Michigan this summer. I got sick during the event, which was not fun, but it was a great event. There's also a new place you can go to find some of these stories. And guess what? It has to do with us. So we have our own little online bookstore, don't we, honey?
Yeah,
It's
we
called
do.
Vine and Branches. Vine and Branches bookshop.com. We have Western civilizational classics there. We try to put all the best classics there. So all the stuff you've heard me talk about, we have there. We don't have S.D. Smith's books because he self-publishes, I believe. But we're going to try to get his stuff on our site as well. I think we have Andrew Peterson's stuff on there, though. We have. Did you get Frank Peretti on there?
Not yet.
Okay, so I don't think we have a speculative fiction section, do we?
Not yet.
Yeah, we should get that. So we'll get a speculative fiction section, and we'll get stuff like Frank Peretti on there, maybe some stuff from Lorehaven. But what we really focused on, and I'm glad we did this, honey, thanks for heading this up, because we focused on classics and we focused on all the stuff we have on our shelves. And so all the stuff like Heinz Feet in High Places, Tolkien, Lewis, we have some, did we get Stephen Lawhead on there? I don't know. I think we got Beowulf on there.
Yeah.
And of course the Divine Commedia. And we got some Arthurian legends. We have Pilgrim's Progress. We have a bunch of George MacDonald.
We have Lives of the Saints on there and Christian Martyrs.
Yes.
As well as lots of different types of Bibles that you can check out as well. So it's very much.
And history stuff.
Yeah.
We have Greek mythology in there. Right? So yeah, some really good stuff. A lot of it we get from our homeschool curriculum, right? But it's a really great bookstore. Again, Vine and Branches bookshop.com. And there's plenty of great stuff on there. We curate everything on there, so that's really important to us. But to sum it up, I think if our cultural efforts were more well read about our greatest myths and legends in Western civilization, we wouldn't be doing so badly right now. We would be putting out things through the lens of the gospel and Christ. And by doing that, all of our stories would have more value in them. All of our stories would have more meaning, and we'd be lasting. They would make a lasting legacy. They wouldn't just last for 5 minutes on a shelf and be the latest thing. They would be lasting like on our Vine and Branches bookstore. These are classics that are going to last forever because they have timeless truths in them. So they're always going to be relevant. So that's why we wanted to do that, because we want to get something real into your hands. We don't just want you to have the latest thing that seems kind of cool right now, which is why, by the way, we didn't put a lot of modern speculative fiction in there. We wanted to kind of go through it more and make sure it's good stuff first. And then we're going to put it in there. All right, you guys. Well, love you. And I just wanted to let you know, like, if we can do better. And these are the stories that matter, not the stuff you're getting from Netflix or from Hollywood. That stuff is going to be gone and nobody's going to care about it in 5 years. So, but if we make something that's lasting, that can really change society. So, all right, guys, have a great weekend. Pray for us because we might be moving soon and we need your prayers. And also check out our daughter's campaign for Boxland. It's a story that we helped her to make into a book. And you can go to the campaign on fundmycomic.com. Just go to fundmycomic.com, type in Boxland, and it'll show up there. And it's just a really cute artwork that our daughter made. And we taught her how to use the tablet as to do artwork on it. She had been drawing on paper for a few years, and we were like, just let's let's up her game. And so she started doing that and she loves it. She always asks us if she can go on the computer or the tablet and just make more artwork. And she's just doing a great job. We're so proud of her. And so this is her first published work. It's so exciting. And you can get a copy for $9, you know, or even just make a dollar donation. And it should be a pretty easy to fulfill campaign. We've got, I don't know, maybe 25, 26 days left on it. And so enjoy it. I hope that you will soon be sending you a book with the theme of a box coming in the mail. Because her story uses the theme of a box. And so that's just a little charming extra element in there. But we hope you guys have a great weekend. Enjoy your Thanksgiving. And give a salute to the culture builder out there making life worth living. We love you guys. Enjoy it this weekend. All right. Bye. Good night.